What conclusions do you draw from this LBC investigation?
Yeah, I think the information is really interesting, and I think this is a really important issue to cover because it's still not being addressed, as your piece points out. Just to be really clear, social housing covers both housing associations and council housing, directly owned council housing. And people can, even in housing associations, people can then still make a complaint to the council local environmental office if they've got damp and mould issues, which is probably one of the reasons that we're seeing these record numbers of complaints to councils, is also about the housing that is provided by housing associations. But as you say, even the council spending on its own properties is really not very much. I mean, the figures sound really big to us. You know, when you're on an ordinary salary, that sounds like those sound like really big numbers. But actually, in terms of the growth, it's not actually that massive for what's needed to keep homes in decent conditions. And also the rents that people have been paying, which should be going towards repairs, is not always all going towards repairs and keeping the homes in good conditions. Quite often a substantial amount is getting creamed off the top so that the councils can build more properties. So I think there is a real need to start, for councils to start focusing on maintaining the conditions of these homes, really.
When you look at 53 million, you divide that by the number of parliamentary constituencies. And, I mean, it's not much per constituency, is it? And so no wonder people have complaints about the condition of their housing. But, I mean, in a way, this is nothing new, is it? I remember in the 1980s, early 1980s, I was responsible for, in a general election campaign, for the biggest housing estate in Norwich. And so I would visit a lot of people in their homes. And I remember being absolutely horrified by the conditions of some of these homes. And, I suspect that 40 years on, nothing has changed.
Yeah, we've seen that. I mean, SHAC was living in a housing association home in council in social housing. The tenants that your reporter spoke to, they were in a Riverside Housing Association. So we are still seeing these cases come up. And I think one of the big reasons for this is really, and again, I think this is brought out somewhat in your piece, is that tenants and residents really struggle to have any power against these huge landlords, whether it's a council or whether it's a housing association or even in the private sector. Really, the balance of power now between landlords and tenants and residents, and in Britain for quite a while, actually, has really been in favour of the landlord. And there really isn't that much protection and certainly very little in terms of representation and genuine kind of tenant voice. And I think this is something that, you mentioned Greater Manchester Tenants Union in your piece are doing some fantastic work trying to address that. SHAC and others are trying to do similar. But I think what we really do need to see is some kind of mass tenant voice for people, which is something that SHAC's trying to get off the ground, because we want to see an end to these. We don't want to keep coming back here. We don't want to keep hearing about children being in hospital for days at a time. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The ones who end up in hospital are the really extreme cases. But there's there's a really big pool of people below that who maybe it isn't so bad for them, that they need to end up in hospital, but really still end up suffering, end up losing a lot of their property because, of the damp and mould in their home, and really suffering and still costing the NHS in a lot of ways, which is something else that we'd like to see an end to. So we need to get the balance of power a bit more back in favour of tenants and residents, really.
And just finally, I mentioned the legislation in the early 2000s where Tony Blair effectively, encouraged, forced, I'm not quite sure which is the right word, for councils to divest themselves of their housing responsibilities into sort of arm's length companies or organisations. What effect has that had? I mean, has it been positive or negative?
I would say overwhelmingly negative. When we talk to our members in SHAC, it's overwhelmingly negative. What we have now is, that was a way of kind of outsourcing the responsibility, wasn't it? Oh, it's not us that's not done the repairs, it's the ALMO, the Arm's Length Organisation. And we see that with layers and layers of subcontractors. You know, these services get, or the repair service gets outsourced. They outsource parts of it to other companies, and you end up with layers and layers. And it can actually be really difficult even to track down who it is that you're meant to be talking to about the repair, because everybody passes you on to somebody else. So I think we need to bring the responsibility absolutely back in-house and make it the council's responsibility, but also make sure that the councils can use the funds that they get from rents to actually keep people's homes in good condition and not have to spend it on other things. So it should be earmarked for keeping those homes in good conditions, because people's rents are going up, but the quality of their housing is going down. It's a crazy situation.